The first shot cracked through the Wyoming hills. Sharp, sudden, like a summer storm breaking the sky. Luke Mercer didn't hesitate. The man in front of him went down before the dust even settled. For a moment, only the wind sliced through the pines, clean, cold, like nothing had happened. But Luke knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. He hadn't fired a shot in 12 years. 12 years of keeping his rifle cold. He thought that part of his life was over. Silence had been his life for 12 long years, fixing fences, gutting fish, speaking more to coyotes than to any living soul. Folks in town said he liked it that way. Truth was, it was just the only way he knew to live with the ghosts he carried. Some regrets fade. Others sink their teeth in and never let go. That afternoon, his quiet was broken by the sight of a girl, barefoot, bruised, maybe 20, running like her life was on fire. And maybe it was. Her eyes. You don't forget eyes like that. Not fear for herself alone. There was something else in them. Fear for someone else. Something bigger. She hit his fence like it was the last solid thing in her world. Before Luke could speak, 4 men came over the rise, armed, calm, moving with the kind of purpose you only see in men who think they own what they're chasing. One of them called her belongings. The word landed heavier than the rifle in Luke's hands. He hated that word, always had. It stuck to the air, foul and heavy, like the smell before a storm. It told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't some barroom scuffle or a ranch dispute gone sideways. This was the kind of rot that sets in when good people look away because it's easier. The kind he'd turned his back on once before and paid for it every day since. I think we've all had moments where we tell ourselves it's not our fight, where we turn the page, change the channel, walk past without asking questions. Reminds me of the time I saw a guy getting yelled at in a parking lot, and I just kept walking. I still wonder if he was okay. Funny how those little choices stick with you. But what does that make us, really? Luke asked himself that right then, standing on his porch with 4 armed men closing in. And he didn't like the answer that came. So he made another one. He chambered the next round, felt the weight of it, and thought about the 12 years he'd spent in silence. Half of it chosen, the other half forced by what he'd let happen. And he whispered something he hadn't said in all that time. Not today. Because some days aren't meant for walking away. And when that line finally comes for you, when you see the kind of evil you can't unsee, you either step over it or you plant your feet and make it yours. That day, Luke Mercer chose the latter. That choice settled over him like the weight of a loaded rifle. Heavy, but steady. June was barely conscious when Luke found her, sprawled across his old couch like a wounded bird that had flown too far. Her ankle was swollen bad, her lips cracked from the sun, and her back carried bruises that told a story no one should have to tell. Luke poured her a glass of water, set it on the crate he used for a coffee table, and just watched her breathe, slow, shaky, like even her lungs didn't trust the air around them. He wasn't good at this. 12 years alone will make you handy with a fence post or a fishing knife, but it won't teach you how to put a person back together. He moved carefully, like she might shatter if he got too close, and then, in the quiet, he caught her eyes. God help him. They looked just like Sarah's. Sarah Mercer, 14 years old, vanished one summer night without a sound. The official story said she'd run away, but Luke had heard the whispers. Men in wagons, a scar-faced stranger who came asking questions too late. He'd spent years trying to bury those memories under work, under silence, under anything he could get his hands on. And now, here was June, showing up like some ghost from the same nightmare, dragging the past right back into his living room. She spoke only once before sleep took her. "They own me," she said. "They own all of us." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't see yet. Luke didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. He'd heard that tone before, in veterans who came home hollow, in kids who'd run so far they didn't believe in the law anymore. The room felt smaller after those words, like even the walls didn't want to hear them. I think we all know what it's like to hear something that pulls you straight back to a moment you wish you could erase. For me, it's a song on the radio that takes me right back to that night in '09. I swear I can smell the rain from that evening, feel the same knot in my chest. Maybe it's a smell, a face, a few words that hit like a fist. For Luke, it was those eyes and that voice. And suddenly, the years between Sarah's disappearance and June's arrival didn't feel like years at all. They felt like the same wound, still open. So we sat there, staring out the window at the settling dust, knowing the men who chased her would be back. And for the first time in 12 long years, he felt something rising in his chest that wasn't just grief. It was the beginning of a truth he'd tried to outrun. Maybe Sarah never left of her own will. Maybe she was taken, just like June. And if that was true, then this wasn't just June's fight. It was his.
Ward's name had floated around these parts for years, like a shadow no one wanted to point at. Rich, untouchable, the kind of man who could buy respect from people who should have known better. But June's voice, cracked and shaking, cut through all that. She told Luke what Ward really was. Not a rancher, not a businessman, a predator. The head of something bigger, meaner, an entire ring that took girls from nowhere towns, promising work, food, safety. They gave him none of it. Instead, they locked him away in the old mill west of Shell, a place most folks believed was just a husk of broken timber and rust. But inside there were maybe a dozen girls, maybe more, living like ghosts in their own skin. June's words painted it too clearly to ignore. "They keep us there until they move us farther west," she said, "somewhere no one comes back from." Then came the detail that lodged itself in Luke's chest like a splinter he couldn't gig out. A girl named Ruth, 14 years old, hadn't seen her mother in 6 months. And when Luke heard that name, it was like a door he'd nailed shut in his mind came crashing open. Ruth, Sarah's old friend. The two of them used to braid each other's hair on the Mercer porch, laughing so loud the cicadas would pause to listen. He could still see 'em with watermelon juice running down their chins, swearing they'd leave this dusty town someday and see the ocean. Sarah never got the chance. And now, if June was telling the truth, maybe Ruth wouldn't either. I think there are moments when the past doesn't just knock, it kicks the door in and demands you look it in the eye. Luke sat there, hearing June's voice, but seeing Sarah's face. Could it be that his sister didn't run away at all? That she was taken, just like these girls? It's a thought that'll hollow you out if you let it. Because if it's true, then every quiet evening he'd spent in that cabin, convincing himself she'd made her own choice, was built on a lie. And in that moment, it stopped being about whether he'd helped June or not. It became something else entirely. It became about Sarah, about Ruth, about every girl whose name nobody bothered to remember. Ward might have been rich, he might have been feared, but now he had Luke Mercer's attention, and that was about to cost him more than he could ever afford.
Luke knew June wasn't just some stranger who'd stumbled into his life. She was a witness, maybe the only one left who could crack this thing open. And witnesses, in a place like this, didn't live long without someone willing to stand between them and the men coming to bury the truth. So we left her at the cabin with enough food for a day, a note on the table, and one instruction. If she heard hooves, don't open the door. Then he saddled up and rode west. The trail to the old mill was rough, the kind of path that makes you feel the land is trying to warn you away. Dry as bone, heat pressing down until your thoughts start to itch. By the time Luke reached the ridge, the sun was burning itself out behind the canyon, spilling orange light across the rusted roof. He slid off the saddle, dropped low against a rock, and pulled out a cracked scope that had seen better days. What he saw turned his stomach. 2 guards posted at the front door, another pacing the perimeter with a dog. A fourth slouched in a chair, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt like he had all the time in the world. And then, at the back window, something that froze Luke in place. A small hand pressed against the glass. Just a second, hesitant and hopeful, before it vanished. Someone was in there. No, more than someone. He stayed frozen a moment longer, trying to decide if that hand was reaching out for help or saying goodbye. He counted his bullets. Not enough for what he was looking at. This wasn't a rescue you pulled off with bravado and good intentions. It was a nest, guarded and mean. So he waited. Hours passed. Darkness came slow, heavy, the kind of quiet that settles right before a storm breaks. Then a wagon rolled in, canvas draped over the back. One man driving, two more on horseback, and beneath the shuffle of hooves, a sound Luke knew too well, crying. Not the loud kind, but the kind that leaks out when you're trying hard not to be heard. That's when it hit him. This was bigger than he thought, more organized, more cruel. These weren't just thugs looking for quick money. This was a system built to break people and make them disappear. I've always believed there's a moment in any fight where you decide who you are. I had one once, nothing as dangerous as Luke's, but I knew if I walked away, I wouldn't like myself in the mirror the next day. For Luke, it happened right there on that ridge, watching the shadows move inside that mill. He could have turned his horse toward home, pretended he'd never seen any of it. But once you've looked that kind of evil in the eye, the choice gets real simple. You either walk away, or you make it your fight. And Luke Mercer had just made up his mind. By sunrise, Luke knew he couldn't do this alone. He rode hard into town, dust trailing behind him like a fuse burning towards something explosive, and found Marshal Reed just as the man was finishing his morning coffee. Luke didn't bother with small talk. He laid it all out. June, the mill, the guards, the wagon, the hand at the window, every rotten piece of it. I think he expected Reed to laugh it off, the way lawmen sometimes do when trouble comes from the wrong side of town. But this time, Reed just listened, and when Luke was done, he nodded once, slow, like a man weighing something heavy, and said, "All right, let's get to work." By nightfall, they had a team together. Not many, just the kind of men who didn't talk much and understood that sometimes you don't wait for permission to do the right thing. They moved quiet, weapons ready but not eager, like they knew that courage isn't about wanting to fight, it's about being ready when there's no other choice. The old mill loomed ahead, its walls soaked in shadows. The air was thick with that stillness before something breaks. Then, like a storm hitting all at once, they were inside. The first guard went down without a sound. The second barely had time to lift his rifle. And then, in the dim light of that place, Luke saw them. 14 girls, thin, frightened, some barely old enough to tie their own hair. They looked at the rescuers like they weren't sure if this was salvation or another trick. One of them was Ruth. Not Sarah's Ruth, but another girl entirely, someone else's daughter, someone's baby stolen from her life. She clung to Luke's arm like it was the first solid thing she'd touched in months. He carried her out himself, the air outside hitting her face like a promise. For the first time that night, the world outside felt bigger than the walls they'd left behind. Later, folks asked Luke why he'd done it. Why now, after 12 years of keeping to himself? He didn't give them a speech. He just said, "Because I remembered who I used to be, and I got tired of running from him." I think there's truth in that for all of us. Sometimes the hardest fight isn't with the evil in front of you, it's with the reflection staring back in the mirror. Luke Mercer walked into that mill to save those girls, but maybe, just maybe, he walked out saving himself too.
Some fights you choose, others choose you. And when they do, you find out real quick who you really are. Luke Mercer didn't ride into that mill because he wanted to be a hero. He did it because he'd spent too many years looking the other way. Too many nights trying to convince himself that silence was the same as peace. It's not. Silence can rot you from the inside if it's built on the things you should have stopped but didn't. We all have a mirror we try to avoid sometimes. You know, the one where you can't dodge the truth about what you've done or what you failed to do. For Luke, that mirror had been gathering dust for 12 long years. But that night, standing in the doorway of that mill, it was like someone wiped it clean. He saw himself, clear as day, and decided he didn't want to be the man staring back anymore. I've always believed that the real measure of a person isn't how loud they shout about what's right, it's whether they'll do something when no one's watching, when it's dangerous, when it costs them something. Like my old neighbor back in Jackson. Quiet guy, never posted a thing. One winter morning I saw him clearing snow off every driveway. No one asked, he just did it. Because evil doesn't just grow in the dark, it thrives in the quiet, in the spaces where good people keep their heads down. And here's where it gets personal. So here's the question. If you saw a small hand pressed against the bars, would you keep walking? Or would you stop, even if it meant making that fight your own? I think about that a lot. Not because I expect any of us to be perfect, but because the choice is always closer than we think. It's in the headlines we scroll past, the neighbors we ignore, the strangers we decide aren't our problem. Maybe this world doesn't need more heroes. Maybe it just needs more people willing to refuse to look the other way. People who will plant their feet and say, "Not today." And if this story stirs something in you, if it reminds you of who you were or who you still might be, stick around. There are more stories like this. Stories about standing up when it's easier to sit down, about finding your voice when the world tells you to stay quiet. Because sometimes, all it takes to tip the scales isn't a hero riding in with a white hat. It's just one person, in the right place, at the right time, who decides they've had enough.